I've built a lot of things in my life. A business, a marriage that lasted 34 years before I lost her, a relationship with my daughter I'm still proud of every single day. You know what I never built a tolerance for? A man who parks his boat in your driveway, hands out keys to your guest house like party favors, and then looks you dead in the eye and calls it family loyalty. But we'll get to Gary. First, let me tell you about the Saturday morning I drove out to check on my lake property and found out my son-in-law's parents had turned it into their personal resort. Grab a coffee, settle in, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because this story is going to take a few turns you won't see coming. My name is Frank Kowalski. I'm 67 years old, born in Erie, Pennsylvania, though I've called Michigan home for the better part of 4 decades. I spent 31 years running a commercial refrigeration company I built from a single delivery van into something that let me retire at 60 with more than I ever expected. I have one daughter, Melissa, 33 years old, sharp as a tack, kinder than she has any right to be given the world she grew up in after her mother passed. And I have a second property, a lakefront cottage on Higgins Lake, 3 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, and a dock I rebuilt myself 2 summers ago, board by board, because I wanted it done right, and I wanted it done by my own hands. I bought that cottage 19 years ago, back when the lake wasn't as built up as it is now, back when you could still get a decent piece of shoreline without selling a kidney. I raised Melissa there every summer of her childhood, taught her to water ski off that dock, taught her to clean a fish at that same picnic table that's still sitting under the maple tree. That cottage isn't just a property to me. It's the only place on earth where every memory in it is a good one. For the last 2 years, I hadn't been using it much. My knees aren't what they used to be, and the drive up from where I live now takes almost 3 hours each way. So I made a decision back in June. I was going to list it as a seasonal rental. My property manager, a sharp young woman named Denise Alvarez, who's been in vacation rental management around the lake for going on 12 years, had already lined up 2 solid families interested in a summer lease. All I needed to do was drive up, do a final walkthrough, take some fresh photos for the listing, maybe touch up the trim on the porch railing, and give Denise the green light to sign the paperwork. That Saturday started like any other. I got up early, made my coffee, packed a cooler with a sandwich and some water for the drive, and got on the road by 7:30. 3 hours north on I-75. The kind of drive I could do with my eyes closed at this point, past Bay City, past the exit for Grayling, watching the pine trees get thicker the further north you go. I had the radio on some classic rock station out of Traverse City, windows cracked because the morning air still had that early summer coolness to it before the heat sets in. I remember being in a genuinely good mood, thinking about whether I wanted to replace the dock chairs before the new tenants moved in, thinking about maybe stopping at the bakery in Roscommon on the way home for one of their cherry turnovers, because you don't drive through cherry country and not stop for a turnover. I turned onto Lakeshore Trail a little after 10:30. The road looked exactly like it always does out there, quiet, tree-lined, gravel crunching under the tires, a couple of kids I didn't recognize riding bikes down near the Hendersons' place, the lake flashing silver through the trees every few hundred feet. Completely ordinary, completely peaceful. And then I came around the last bend before my driveway, and my stomach did something I can only describe as a slow drop, the kind you feel in an elevator when the cable catches wrong. There were 4 vehicles parked in my driveway and along the grass shoulder. A Ford F-250 with a bass boat hitched to the back of it, the boat itself sitting half in the water at the end of my dock, tied off like it owned the place. A silver Buick Enclave. A rented U-Haul cargo van, the kind people use for moving, not for a weekend at the lake. And a Jeep Wrangler I didn't recognize with a University of Toledo parking permit still stuck to the windshield. My gate, the one I specifically keep latched because of the drop-off down toward the water, standing wide open. And from somewhere behind the cottage, I could hear a radio playing, laughter, the unmistakable sizzle, and smell of something cooking on a grill. Not my grill. I don't own a grill anymore. I sold it 2 years ago when I stopped coming up as often. I sat in my truck for a good 30 seconds with the engine ticking, just staring at that boat tied to my dock, letting my brain work through it the way it does when something refuses to make sense no matter how you turn it. And then I recognized the Ford F-250, Gary Whitfield's truck, my son-in-law's father. I'd seen that same truck, that same bass boat, parked at Melissa and Tom's place in Saginaw more times than I could count over the last 3 years. I turned off the engine, put my keys in my jacket pocket, and walked through my own gate. 7 people. There were 7 people on my property. My property, occupied like a campground. I want you to really picture this, because I need you to understand exactly what I was looking at. Gary Whitfield standing at my grill, my late wife's grill that I thought I'd sold, but apparently someone had hauled a replacement up here, spatula in hand, wearing swim trunks and no shirt, completely at ease, like a man hosting a party at his own lake house. His wife Donna sitting in one of my Adirondack chairs on the porch, a glass of white wine sweating in her hand, sunglasses pushed up into her hair. Their son Kevin, Tom's brother, out on my dock untying my kayak from where I keep it chained to the dock post. Except it wasn't chained anymore. The chain was sitting cut on the grass. Kevin's wife lounging on a beach towel I didn't recognize on my own dock. And 2 people I had genuinely never laid eyes on in my life. A heavy-set man in a Detroit Tigers cap flipping burgers alongside Gary, and a teenage girl scrolling on her phone in one of my porch chairs like she paid the mortgage on it. Gary saw me first. He didn't flinch. Didn't even slow down flipping that burger. His face broke into this wide, easy grin, the kind of grin you give an old friend who's late to his own party. "Frank, there he is. We were wondering if you'd make it up this weekend." I stood there at the gate and said nothing, not because I didn't have words, but because I was still taking inventory. The cut chain on the grass, Donna's wine glass, the stranger's kids running down toward my dock, Kevin standing in my kayak now, paddling it out into the water like he was auditioning for a commercial. Then I looked back at Gary. "Gary," I said, and my voice came out flatter and more level than I expected it to, like something in me had already decided how this conversation was going to go before my brain caught up. "What exactly is happening here?" He waved the spatula at me, a little dismissive flick of the wrist. The universal gesture of a man who thinks you're overreacting to something perfectly reasonable. "Ah, don't worry about it," he said. "Tom said it was fine. We just wanted a family weekend up at the lake before the season ends. Figured, hey, it's basically family property at this point, right?" He gestured out toward the water with the spatula, like he was showing off real estate he was trying to sell me. "Beautiful spot, by the way. Melissa's gonna love this place once you 2 hand it over." I let that sentence sit in the air for exactly 1 breath. "Tom said it was fine," I repeated. "Well, it will be theirs eventually," Donna offered from her Adirondack chair, swirling her wine like she was commenting on nothing more consequential than the weather. "Once you and Melissa work out the details. So really, we're just—" And then Gary laughed. A big, open, completely unguarded laugh, like something had just landed perfectly, and he was enjoying the punchline. I need you to sit with me in that laugh for a second, because that's the moment. Not the cut chain, not the strangers on my dock. Not even Donna's comment about it being basically family property. The laugh. Gary Whitfield's full, easy, from the gut laugh. The laugh of a man who has already done the math in his head and arrived at an answer where everything I built over 4 decades eventually funnels into his family's lap through his son's marriage. The laugh of a man who genuinely believed that whatever discomfort I was standing there feeling wasn't going to amount to anything, because what was I really going to do about it? Kevin snorted from out on the water. The stranger in the tiger's cap chuckled along without even knowing what was funny, just following the room. The teenage girl didn't look up from her phone. I let the laugh finish. I didn't rush it, didn't interrupt it. I let it run its course the way you let a man keep talking until he's said all the things he's going to regret. Then I walked in through the gate, not fast, not with any heat in my step. I walked the way I walk into every space I own, like I had all the time in the world and every right to it. I walked past the grill, past Donna's chair, all the way down to the edge of my own dock, and stopped there. I looked out at Kevin sitting in my kayak. I looked back at the cut chain lying in the grass. I looked at that boat tied off where my dock cleats have never once held anything but my own boat in 19 years. Then I turned to Gary, and I spoke quietly enough that Donna actually leaned forward in her chair without seeming to realize she was doing it. "I'm going to say this exactly once," I said. "This is my land, my deed, my name on the title. I don't know what Tom told you, and I don't much care what you told yourselves on the drive up here. But I need every person, every vehicle, and that boat off my property before I'm back through this gate. Frank, come on, we're fam. Gary, just his name. Flat and final, like a door closing. He stopped talking. I looked around one more time, slow, letting my eyes land on each face, the way you look at something you're committing to memory, because you know you're going to need to remember it exactly like this later. Then I walked back through the gate, got in my truck, and paused with my hand on the open door. Get that chain replaced, I said. And Gary, get your boat off my dock before you leave, or I'm calling it in as abandoned property and letting the county deal with it. I shut the door and pulled out of that driveway at a completely normal speed, gravel crunching soft under the tires. Because telling them to get off my property, that was the floor. What came after was going to be the ceiling, and Gary Whitfield had absolutely no idea how high it went. I drove about 10 minutes down the road and pulled into the little party store in Roscommon, the same one that sells the cherry turnovers I'd been thinking about that morning, except I had zero appetite now. I sat in the parking lot with the engine running and the air conditioning fighting against the June heat pressing on the windshield, and I called my daughter. Melissa picked up on the second ring. Hey, Dad, everything okay? No, I said. But before I explain anything, I need you to answer one question honestly. A pause. I could hear the concern creeping into her voice already. Okay. Did you or Tom give Gary a key to the lake gate? Silence. Long enough that I knew the answer before she said a word. Dad, Tom, might have given his dad the gate code a while back, like over a year ago, for emergencies. Why? What's going on? What? I closed my eyes and rubbed the bridge of my nose. Because right now there are 7 people on my property. Gary's got a boat tied to my dock. Kevin cut the chain off my kayak. And Donna informed me this is, and I'm quoting her directly, basically family property at this point. Another silence, this one heavier. Oh my God. Dad, I swear I had no idea. Tom didn't tell me anything about a lake weekend. I believe you, I said, and I meant it. Melissa has never once given me a reason not to trust her. But I need you to talk to Tom tonight. Not about the lake. About what his family thinks they're entitled to. Because that laugh Gary just gave me, Melissa, that wasn't a joke. That was a man who genuinely believes my life's work is already halfway into his family's pocket. I'll talk to him, she said quietly. Dad, I'm so sorry. This isn't okay. I know it's not, I said. But don't apologize for something you didn't do. Just give me a little time to handle it my way. Can you do that? Yeah, she said. Yeah, of course. I drove home that afternoon, and I want to be honest with you. I didn't sleep well that night. Not because I was angry, though I was, but because that laugh kept replaying in my head, over and over, and underneath the anger, I felt something else settling in, something colder and more useful. Clarity. The next morning, I called my attorney, a man named Ron Pasternak, who's handled my business and estate matters for almost 20 years. Ron's the kind of lawyer who doesn't raise his voice either, which is exactly why I've kept him this long. 2 men who don't yell get a lot more done than 2 men who do. Ron, I said, I need you to clear your calendar for a project. It's not urgent in the sense that anyone's dying. It's urgent in the sense that I want it airtight before anyone else in my family finds out what I'm doing. Tell me everything, he said. So I did. I told him about the lake house, about Gary and Donna, about the cut chain, and the boat, and the laugh. And I told him what I wanted to build, not out of spite, but out of the same instinct that made me rebuild that dock board by board instead of hiring it out. I wanted something that would hold. Here's what we did over the following 6 weeks, and I want to walk you through it, because I think the how of it matters just as much as the why. First, I called Denise, my property manager, and told her to move forward with leasing the cottage after all, but with one change. Instead of a standard seasonal lease to a renting family, I had her draft the agreement so the cottage would be placed into a limited liability company, one that I owned entirely, with the rental income flowing into a dedicated account. On paper, to anyone looking in from the outside, the cottage was no longer simply Frank's lake house that people assumed would someday just pass hands informally through family goodwill. It was now a business asset, owned by an entity, managed by a professional, generating income like any other investment I'd built over the years. Second, I sat down with Ron and restructured a piece of my estate plan that had been sitting untouched for almost a decade. I want to be clear about something here, because I know how this can sound. I was never planning to leave my daughter out of anything. Melissa is getting everything I have, every dollar, every asset, every ounce of what I built. That was never in question. What was in question, after that Saturday, was how it would arrive to her, and more specifically, what protections existed around it once it did. Ron drafted what's called a spendthrift trust provision layered into Melissa's inheritance, the kind of structure that protects an asset from being treated as joint marital property in the event of a divorce, and more importantly, for what I was dealing with, the kind of structure that makes it legally and practically very difficult for extended in-laws to ever exert influence or claim informal ownership over what's inside it. The lake cottage specifically was going to be placed inside an irrevocable trust, controlled by a trustee, with Melissa as the lifetime beneficiary, and any future grandchildren of mine as the ultimate remainder beneficiaries. Not Tom. Not Tom's parents. Not Tom's brother Kevin with his cut chains and his commandeered kayak. My grandchildren, whenever they come along, and nobody else. Third, and this part took the longest, Ron and I worked with Denise to actually list the cottage on the market, quietly, through a private sale channel rather than a public listing, to a genuine buyer, a retired school teacher from Grand Rapids named Carol Ann Hutchins, who'd been looking for exactly that kind of lake property for 2 years and paid full asking price without blinking. I sold it. The actual physical cottage, the one with the dock I rebuilt with my own hands, the one where I taught my daughter to water ski, I sold it in early August. I know that might sound like I gave something up. I didn't. Because the moment that sale closed, every dollar from it went directly into a new purchase, a larger property on Torch Lake, one of the most beautiful stretches of water in the entire state, purchased outright in the name of the trust itself. Not in my name. Not in a way that any relative, current or future, could ever again assume was theirs by proximity or by marriage. A property that exists from day one, already inside the protective structure Ron built, already earmarked for Melissa's lifetime use and enjoyment, and already positioned to pass eventually to grandchildren who don't exist yet, completely insulated from anyone who might one day feel entitled to a piece of it just because they showed up at a barbecue often enough. While all of this was happening quietly through the summer, I did something else, something a little more personal. I took a trip. Just me, no fanfare. Down to New Mexico, a state I'd always wanted to see and never made the time for. I drove through Santa Fe, sat in the town square eating green chile, everything, drove out to White Sands, and watched the sun turn those dunes the color of bone at sunset. I sent Melissa a couple of postcards along the way, nothing dramatic, just a father letting his daughter know he was thinking of her. I needed the distance. Honestly, I needed to be somewhere with no lake, no boat, no cut chain, while the paperwork did its quiet work back home. By the time I got back in early September, everything was finalized. The sale was closed, the trust was funded, the new property on Torch Lake was purchased and titled exactly the way Ron and I intended. I called a family meeting. Just the 4 of us, me, Melissa, Tom, and Ron, sitting in on it as counsel at my kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon in mid-September. I made coffee. I set out a plate of the cherry turnovers I never got around to buying that day in June, picked up instead from a bakery closer to home. Small detail, but I wanted the room to feel calm before anything else happened. Ron laid it out for them plainly, one document at a time. The sale of the original cottage, the formation of the trust, the purchase of the new property on Torch Lake, already titled inside that trust, the spendthrift provisions, the clause that made clear, in language even a first-year law student could parse without confusion, that this asset and everything connected to it belonged to Melissa for her lifetime, and after that, to her children, and to absolutely no one else, under any circumstance, ever. I watched Tom's face while Ron talked. I want to be fair to Tom here, because Tom is not his father, and I've always believed that. Tom sat there reading that trust document twice. I could tell by the way his eyes kept going back up to the top of the page, and when he finally looked up at me, his expression wasn't anger. It wasn't defensiveness either. It was something closer to understanding. the specific kind of understanding that settles into a man's face when he realizes his father did something that actually reflects poorly on the family, and there's no version of loyalty that requires him to pretend otherwise. "Frank," he said quietly, "I need you to know I had no idea my dad was going to do what he did that Saturday. None of it. And I get why you're doing this." "I believe you," I told him. "This isn't about you, Tom. I want to be very clear about that. This is about making sure that what I built never becomes something somebody else feels entitled to just because they showed up uninvited enough times. That protects Melissa. It protects your future kids. And honestly, son, it protects you too, because now there's no ambiguity for your family to exploit, not even by accident." Melissa hadn't said much through the whole meeting. She'd been staring down at the documents, her jaw tight, and when Ron got to the part about the Torch Lake property, about the postcards, about the fact that her father had quietly rebuilt an entire piece of their family's future, while she had no idea any of it was happening, she made a small sound, not quite a word, just something that escapes a person when it hits somewhere they weren't guarding. Then she reached over and put her hand on top of mine, right there on the kitchen table. "Dad," she said, "I don't even know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," I told her. "Just know that everything I built it for you, from the day you were born, and protecting it isn't about not trusting you. It's about making sure that love doesn't turn into carelessness. Because building something and not protecting it, that's not really love. That's just carelessness wearing a nice face." Ron gathered his documents, closed his briefcase with that soft, final click lawyers seem to develop after enough years in the profession, and looked at me. I nodded. Then I stood up from the table and, out of habit more than anything, buttoned the middle button of my jacket, the way you do when something's finished and you're ready for whatever comes next. I looked around that table, at Ron, who had built this whole structure with me and executed it without a single wasted motion, at Tom, who had his father's height but none of his father's assumptions, and more quiet decency in him than he'd ever really had to use before that Sunday, at Melissa, who was looking at me with an expression I still don't have one clean word for, something raw and grateful and a little overwhelmed all at once. "Now," I said, "who wants a turnover?" Ron stayed for coffee. Tom shook my hand on the way out, a firm grip that said more than words would have. Melissa hugged me at the door, held on a second longer than usual, and told me she loved me before she left. My buddy Dave called me that Wednesday. Dave and I have known each other since our 20s, back when I was still driving that refrigeration delivery van myself. "So how'd it go?" he asked. "Fine," I said. "Fine? That's all I get after weeks of you being cagey about this whole thing?" "It went exactly the way it was supposed to go," I told him. "Ron did excellent work. The paperwork's airtight. Tom understood everything, and honestly, I think he respects me more now than he did before. And Melissa," I walked over to my kitchen window while I talked, looked out at my own backyard, ordinary and quiet, nothing dramatic about it at all, which after that summer felt like exactly the right kind of ordinary. "Melissa hugged me on her way out," I said. "The real kind." Dave was quiet for a second. "And Gary?" "When Gary finds out, and he will, because Donna's never once kept her mouth shut about anything in the 15 years I've known that family, he's going to hear all of it secondhand. The sale, the trust, the new property he'll never so much as see, let alone set a boat on. He's going to sit in his garage up in Saginaw with his boat that's going nowhere near Torch Lake, and he's going to have to sit with the fact that the day he stood at my grill and laughed in my face was the single most expensive laugh of his entire life." "And what do you think he's going to take from that?" Dave asked. I set my coffee mug down on the counter. "That the man he laughed at wasn't nearly as slow as he assumed," I said. "The trust is fully funded now. Torch Lake is quiet, beautiful, and completely out of reach for anyone who thinks proximity to my daughter's marriage entitles them to a piece of what I spent 40 years building. Gary Whitfield has not been invited back to that lake, or to my home, since that Saturday in June, and as far as I'm concerned, he's welcome to enjoy that boat of his on whatever public launch he can find, because it will never again touch water that belongs to my family. He knows exactly what happened now. He just has to live with it every single morning he looks at that boat, sitting in his driveway, with nowhere left to go. If this story hit home for you, or if you've ever dealt with a family member who thought your hard work was somehow theirs to claim, hit that like button, subscribe if you're new here, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every single one. I'll see you in the next story.